He never planned to fall apart that day. All he wanted was someone to help clean the old barn, clear out the dust, fix a few boards, maybe bring some life back to the place his late wife once loved. But when she arrived, the quiet widow with tired eyes and two small children clinging to her skirt, something inside him shifted. The wind carried her voice softly as she said, "I can work hard, sir. I just need a chance." He nodded without a word, not knowing that by letting her step through that barn door, he was about to open the one he'd kept locked inside his heart for years. Days passed. Her laughter began to echo through the ranch, gentle as morning rain. The twins played in the hay, their giggles chasing away the silence that had haunted those wooden walls. And one night, under the light of an old oil lamp, he found her there. The twins asleep in her arms, her head bowed in exhaustion. The soft rise and fall of their breathing stirred something deep within him. His chest tightened. His throat burned. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt the warmth of life again, fragile, pure, and unbearably beautiful. He had hired a widow to clean his barn. But what he saw broke him in ways he never expected. Sometimes love doesn't come riding in on a horse. Sometimes it walks quietly through the dust, carrying two sleeping children in its arms. The sun hung low over the prairie, its light spilling across the fields like honey over rough earth. The barn stood silent in the distance, its roof bent, its doors hanging tired, and the air thick with dust and memories. Thomas McGraw leaned against the fence, hat low over his brow, staring at that broken place like a man staring at his own heart. It had been 5 long years since Mary passed. 5 years since laughter had touched this land. Her voice used to drift through these fields, calling his name from the porch. Now only the wind answered back. Every corner of the ranch held a memory he couldn't bear to face, so he let it all rot, the barn, the house, the garden, everything. He'd stopped going into town. Folks said he'd gone cold, that the fire in his eyes had turned to ash. Maybe they were right. Every night he sat by the old lamp, staring at her photograph, whispering words that never reached her. "Mary, I did my best." But it wasn't enough, was it? The days had blurred together like pages smudged by rain, until one morning, while feeding the horses, he saw the dust trail of a wagon coming down the hill. A woman's silhouette against the rising sun, 2 small shapes beside her. Thomas frowned, shading his eyes. He wasn't expecting anyone, but something told him this wasn't just another traveler passing through. The wagon stopped by the fence. The woman climbed down slowly, her dress worn, her hands trembling from the road. 2 small children peeked out from behind her skirt, twins, a boy and a girl, maybe 4 or 5. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Sir," she said, "I heard you might be needing help. I can clean, cook, work the stables, whatever's needed." "I just need a roof over their heads." Thomas looked at her, really looked. There was sorrow in her eyes, but not weakness. Something about her reminded him of the woman he'd lost, the same quiet strength, the same fire beneath the weariness. He nodded slowly. "The barn's in a bad way," he said. "You sure you can handle it?" "I've handled worse," she whispered, glancing at her children. The twins clung to her legs, shy but curious. One held a small wooden horse carved from old pine. The other smiled faintly, as if trying to be brave. Thomas cleared his throat, trying to hide the lump rising there. "You can start tomorrow. There's a small cabin behind the stables. It ain't much, but it's dry." The woman smiled, just barely. "Thank you, Mr. McGraw," he replied. "Thomas McGraw." "And these are Eli and Grace." As the wagon creaked away toward the cabin, Thomas stood there, hat in hand, watching the evening settle over the land. He didn't know why, but something in his chest stirred, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just the sound of a woman's voice calling life back into a place that had long forgotten how the next morning broke quiet and pale, the sky washed in soft gold. Thomas rose before dawn, as he always did, though sleep had only brushed his eyes for a moment or two. The ranch was still, the kind of silence that carried both peace and pain. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside. The air smelled of earth and cold wind. Somewhere beyond the barn, a rooster called out like it was announcing another day he hadn't asked for. He walked toward the stables, but his gaze kept drifting toward the small cabin behind him. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin, careful, like whoever lit it didn't want to waste too much wood. He found himself wondering if the widow had slept at all. He didn't even know why he cared. By the time the sun broke over the horizon, Clara was already at work. She had tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, sleeves rolled up, sweeping the barn floor as her children sat in the corner, playing with a bundle of sticks and hay. Her movements were steady, patient. Each stroke of the broom seemed to erase a bit of the sorrow the place carried. Thomas stood by the door for a while, watching. He hadn't seen anyone work with that kind of quiet determination in years. Something about it reminded him of Mary, how she used to hum while mending clothes or feeding the hens, never needing anyone to tell her what came next. Clara turned when she noticed him. The little ones wake with the sun anyway. He cleared his throat, awkwardly. Start whenever you need to. You're doing fine work. Her smile was faint but warm. Thank you, sir. He nodded and moved to the hayloft, pretending to busy himself with tools that didn't need fixing. But every now and then he glanced down, watching the twins laugh, hearing their small voices fill the barn where grief had once echoed. As the day wore on, Clara made a small pot of stew from what little she had. The smell drifted through the air, rich, familiar. Thomas couldn't remember the last time food smelled like home. When she offered him a bowl, he hesitated, then took it. It felt strange, sharing a meal not out of habit, but out of quiet kindness. While they ate, Clara spoke little. Only once did she mention her husband. He was a good man, she said, staring at the fire. Fever took him last winter. I tried to keep the farm, but some things you can't fight alone. Thomas didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, staring into his bowl. That night, after the chores were done and the lanterns dimmed, he sat again on his porch, listening to the faint laughter of the twins from their cabin. It wasn't loud, just enough to remind him that life, somehow, still existed here. He looked up at the stars, cold and endless, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a pause. Something was changing on that ranch, though he didn't yet understand what. But he knew one thing: the barn didn't feel empty anymore. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch began to breathe again. The barn no longer looked like a grave of old wood and silence. It smelled of hay, soap, and life. Clara had a way of moving through the place that made even the dust behave. She spoke softly to the animals, sang to her children while she worked, and left little traces of care in every corner she touched. Thomas tried not to notice. He told himself he was just grateful for the help. But every morning, when he saw her stepping out of the cabin with her hair loose in the wind, something inside him stirred, a warmth he thought had died with Mary. He'd catch himself watching her, then look away, tightening his jaw as if shame could chase the feeling back down. Still, his eyes found her again. Maybe it was the way she smiled when Eli offered her a wildflower, or how she always knelt to listen when Grace spoke, as if every word from her little girl mattered more than the world itself. One afternoon, as the sun bled orange across the sky, Clara climbed a ladder to patch a hole in the barn roof. Thomas stood below, pretending to stack hay but really just keeping an eye out, old habit from years of working beside someone he cared for. "You don't have to do that yourself," he called up. "I've done worse," she said, glancing down with a grin that carried both exhaustion and courage. "Besides, if I wait for someone else, it might never get done." He shook his head, but smiled. "You sound like Mary used to." The words slipped out before he could stop them. A stillness followed. Clara paused, her hand resting on the beam. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. He nodded, eyes on the dirt. "She passed 5 years ago. Childbirth. Neither made it." The air grew heavy for a moment. The only sound was the rustling of the wind against the boards. Clara climbed down slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "No one ever really gets over something like that." Thomas nodded, his voice low. "No. You just learn to walk around the hole it leaves." She looked at him then, not with pity but understanding. "I lost mine last winter. Fever took him in 3 days. I buried him with my own hands before the ground froze." Neither spoke after that. There was nothing to say that grief hadn't already said for them, but something in that shared silence softened the distance between them. That night, Thomas sat at his table long after supper, the lamp flickering low. Through the open window he could hear Clara humming to her twins, a soft tune full of longing. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, letting the sound wash over him. It wasn't just a song. It was life returning to a place that had forgotten how to feel. Out in the barn, the wind whispered through the rafters, and for the first time it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like hope finding its way home. The wind had turned cooler now, carrying the scent of rain over the hills. Autumn was creeping across the prairie, and the fields shimmered gold in the fading sun. Life on the ranch had found a rhythm again, quiet, steady, almost peaceful. But beneath it, something unspoken lingered between Thomas and Clara, something neither dared to name. Every morning they worked side by side, speaking little, yet somehow saying everything. He'd hand her a tool. She'd meet his eyes for a second too long. The twins had grown comfortable on the ranch, running barefoot through the grass, laughing with a freedom that made the place feel alive again. Sometimes Thomas caught himself smiling without realizing it. Those small voices echoing through the barn were like the sound of forgiveness. One evening, dark clouds gathered low the plains. The air was heavy, restless. Clara hurried to bring the twins inside while Thomas checked the roof of the barn. He noticed a loose beam, water-stained and sagging. The storm rolled closer, thunder cracking like distant gunfire. He called out to Clara, "Stay inside with the children. I'll handle this." But she didn't listen. She ran out into the rain, clutching a lantern against the wind. "You can't fix it alone," she shouted. Together they pulled at the beam, lightning flashing through the open doors, illuminating their faces, determined, soaked, side by side against the storm. When the thunder grew too fierce, Thomas guided her and the twins inside the barn. They huddled near the hay, the rain drumming above like an endless heartbeat. The twins clung to their mother, eyes heavy with sleep. Thomas sat close, watching as Clara wrapped them in a blanket, her arms cradling them gently. The lamplight flickered across her face, soft, tired, beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. The twins' breathing slowed, their small chests rising and falling against her. And in that moment, something inside Thomas cracked wide open. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, but now, watching that woman hold her children, all those walls began to crumble. The sight of their innocence, her quiet strength, the peace in their sleep, it tore through him. He turned away, pressing a hand to his chest as tears he hadn't shed in years burned in his eyes. He thought of Mary, of the child they never got to hold, of all the nights he'd cursed heaven for taking everything. And now here, in the faint light of the barn, he saw life again, fragile, warm, breathing right beside him. Clara looked up and saw the pain on his face. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She just reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. That simple touch said everything words could not. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something far greater was breaking, the silence between two broken hearts learning, slowly, to beat again. Morning came soft and gray, the sky washed clean after the night storm. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and hay. Thomas woke before the sun, as he always did, but the quiet felt different now, gentler somehow. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the damp soil, and looked toward the barn. Smoke curled from its chimney, and for a moment he just stood there, listening to the faint hum of life within it. Inside, Clara was already awake. She had spread the twins' small clothes by the hearth to dry. Eli sat on her lap, still sleepy. his hair a mess of curls. Grace was humming softly to herself, pretending to brush the old mare's mane with a piece of straw. The simple sight made something ache in Thomas's chest, a quiet longing he didn't know how to name. He cleared his throat softly. "Roof held up," he said, almost shy. "Could have been worse." Clara turned, smiling faintly. "Thanks to you," she said. "You didn't have to risk yourself like that." He shrugged, eyes fixed on the floor. "Couldn't let the storm take the barn? It's all I've got left." She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," she said gently. "It's not all you've got." The words hung between them, soft but sharp enough to cut through the silence. He didn't answer. He just nodded, then turned toward the door, heart thudding with something that wasn't quite pain, but wasn't peace either. That afternoon the sun broke through the clouds, warm and golden. Clara worked in the garden, her hands deep in the soil. Thomas joined her without a word, helping to rebuild the fence that had fallen in the storm. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their labor saying all the things they didn't dare speak. After a while, Clara broke the quiet. "I used to think God forgot about me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After my husband died, I begged for a sign, something, anything, to show me he was still there." She paused, pressing the dirt with her palms. "Then I realized maybe the sign isn't in what he gives. Maybe it's in what's left standing after the storm." Thomas stopped working, leaning on his shovel. The wind brushed his face, carrying her words with it. He wanted to believe her, but believing meant letting go of the anger that had kept him company for years. He spoke quietly. "When Mary died, I stopped praying. I couldn't see the point. The house felt like a grave, and every sunrise just reminded me she wasn't here to see it." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. "Maybe she is," she said. "Maybe not in the way you expect, but maybe she's in the things that still grow." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The breeze carried the sound of the twins' laughter from inside the barn, bright and unbroken. Thomas closed his eyes. It sounded like life trying to find its way back through the cracks. That night he sat on the porch again, watching the last light fade. The twins were asleep, and Clara was singing softly inside. He looked up at the stars, the same ones he used to curse, and felt the faintest pull of peace. Maybe she was right. Maybe God hadn't forgotten him. Maybe he'd just sent him someone who knew what it meant to be broken, and brave enough to love again anyway. The days grew warmer as summer crept back over the land. Wildflowers stretched along the fences, and the air buzzed with the hum of bees and the soft rhythm of ranch life returning. Thomas found himself rising earlier, working harder, smiling more than he ever had in years. But beneath it all, there was still a quiet storm brewing inside him, a fear he couldn't name, one that came every time he looked at Clara and felt something stronger than gratitude. One evening the sky turned the color of fire, the kind of sunset that feels too beautiful to trust. Thomas was mending the corral gate when he saw Clara walking toward the barn, her skirt brushing the tall grass, her twins trailing behind her. She carried a small basket of bread she'd baked, her laughter soft as the wind. He couldn't help but watch her. There was something about the way she moved, careful but certain, like someone who learned to live with loss and still find grace in small things. "Long day?" she asked as she handed him the basket. "Always," he replied, a faint smile on his lips. "But I don't mind it much any more." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither looked away. The twins ran ahead into the barn, giggling as they played in the hay. Clara turned to follow, and Thomas followed after her, the warmth of the sunset spilling through the open doors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and wood smoke. The twins had curled up together, worn out from play, their small faces peaceful beneath the lamplight. Clara knelt beside them, tucking the blanket gently over their shoulders. Her hands lingered there for a moment, trembling slightly. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching. His breath caught in his chest. There she was, a mother, a widow, a woman who had carried her pain quietly, without complaint. And there they were, her children, sleeping in her arms as though the world itself couldn't touch them. Something inside him gave way. It wasn't loud or sudden, but deep, like a river breaking through a dam. He stepped closer, each heartbeat heavier than the last. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. "They remind you of her, don't they?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Of what could have been? He sank to his knees beside her, unable to hold back the tears that had waited 5 long years. "I used to dream of this," he said. "Mary holding our child, the sound of laughter in this barn. I thought if I worked hard enough, maybe I could earn it back, but life doesn't bargain." Clara reached for his hand. Her touch was steady, warm. "Maybe it doesn't bargain," she said, "but it can forgive." The words broke him. His shoulders shook as years of silence poured out. Grief, anger, guilt, everything he buried beneath the weight of his own stubborn heart. Clara said nothing more. She just stayed there, her hand in his, the twins asleep between them, the world outside fading into night. When he finally looked up, the storm inside him was quiet. He saw not the ghost of what he'd lost, but the grace of what had found him, a woman who understood sorrow, children who knew joy despite it, and a home that was slowly learning how to breathe again. The lamp flickered, its flame small but steady. He whispered, almost to himself, "I thought my heart was done feeling anything. But I was wrong." Clara smiled, brushing a tear from his cheek. "Sometimes," she said, "we don't find peace. It finds us." And in that barn, with rain beginning to fall soft and steady outside, Thomas felt something he hadn't in years, the simple, quiet truth of being alive. The rain continued through the night, soft and endless, tapping gently on the old barn roof like a lullaby meant for the broken. Thomas sat there long after Clara and the twins had drifted to sleep, his back against the wooden wall, the lantern burning low beside him. The sound of their breathing filled the silence, small, steady, real. For years he had lived in a house full of memories, but this was different. This was life, happening right in front of him. He looked at Clara, her arms still around the children, her face peaceful in the dim light. For the first time he realized how strong she truly was. Not the loud kind of strength that shouts at the world, but the quiet kind that endures it, the kind that keeps moving even when there's nothing left to move for. He felt something inside him shift again, something tender and frightening all at once. When morning came, the storm had passed. The air was clear and cool, the fields glistening under the sun. Thomas stepped outside and breathed deep, the smell of wet grass sharp in his chest. It was as if the land itself had been washed clean. He stood there for a while, letting the light touch his face, and thought about all the years he'd spent hiding from it. Later he found Clara by the fence, hanging clothes to dry. Her hair was loose, sunlight catching in the strands. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "Didn't think you'd be up this early," she said, smiling faintly. "Didn't sleep much," he admitted. "Had a lot to think about." She nodded, her hands busy with the laundry. "Storms will do that," she said quietly. "They take what's weak and show you what's still standing." Thomas leaned on the fence beside her, watching the wind ripple through the fields. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Starting over somewhere new?" Clara paused, then shook her head. "You can run from the land, from people, but not from the things inside you." "I stopped trying." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not a widow anymore, not a worker or a guest. He saw a woman who had walked through the same kind of fire he had and come out carrying light. "Clara," he said, a voice low, "I don't know what this is, or what it should be. But when I saw you holding those children last night, I realized something. I've been alive all this time, but I haven't been living." She turned to him, eyes shining in the morning light. "Then start," she whispered. "You don't need to ask permission to live again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The twins' laughter echoed from inside the barn, bright, careless, pure. Thomas felt a smile break through the years of grief that had hardened his face. He looked out across the land, his land, and for once it didn't feel empty. The fences, the fields, even the lonely hills in the distance seemed alive again, as if they, too, had been waiting for this. He took a slow breath and said softly, "Maybe this is what forgiveness feels like." Clara's hand brushed his, gentle but sure. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it's love, coming back to a place it never really left." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the wet earth and the promise of quiet days ahead. Thomas closed his eyes and let it wash over him, the past fading into something that finally felt like peace. And for the first time in 5 long years, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The weeks that followed felt like the land itself had begun to heal. The mornings came softer, the air lighter, the laughter of the twins echoing through the fields like birdsong after a long winter. The barn, once a place of dust and sorrow, now smelled of hay, bread, and life. Thomas found himself humming while he worked, sometimes without even realizing it. He repaired the porch rail that had broken years ago. He painted the barn doors a deep red, just as Mary once wanted. And when Clara offered to help, he didn't argue. They worked side by side, the kind of quiet that only 2 people who've known pain can share, not empty, but peaceful. Some evenings, after supper, the 4 of them would sit on the steps watching the sun melt behind the hills. Eli would fall asleep first, head on his sister's shoulder. Grace would hum one of Clara's soft mountain songs, her tiny voice fading with the dusk. Thomas would glance at Clara, and in that light he saw not the widow who come asking for work, but the woman who brought warmth back into his world. He never spoke much about what he felt. Words had never come easy for him, but Clara understood the language of silence. One evening, when the sky turned to silver and the crickets began to sing, she said softly, "You've been fixing everything around here, but maybe it's you who's been fixed." Thomas chuckled, eyes low. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just needed a reason to stop running from ghosts." Clara smiled faintly. "We all do. Some of us just find that reason later than others." He turned to her then, his voice quieter. "You ever think you'd find peace again?" She shook her head. "No, but I think peace found me when I stopped looking." The wind moved through the grass, slow and easy, carrying with it the scent of pine and home. Thomas reached out, taking her hand. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like something the earth itself had been waiting to see. As the months passed, the ranch began to thrive. The crops grew tall, the horses strong. The small garden behind the cabin bloomed wild with flowers Clara had planted, daisies, lavender, and one single red rose that she said was for remembering. On Sundays, they rode into town together. People noticed how different Thomas looked now. The hard lines around his eyes softened, his voice lighter. When someone asked if Clara worked for him, he only smiled and said no. "She works with me." By autumn, the house was full of warmth. The twins had taken to calling him Paul without thinking, and the first time he heard it, his throat closed up so tight he couldn't answer. That night, he stood by Mary's grave under the quiet sky and whispered, "Thank you for sending them." Life didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt earned, rebuilt from pieces of loss, held together by kindness. One evening as the sun fell low, Thomas and Clara stood at the fence watching Eli chase fireflies. Grace ran to him, holding a jar that glowed like a lantern in her hands. Clara laughed softly, leaning into him. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man living. "Funny thing," he said, voice low. "All this time, I thought love died with her." Clara looked up at him, eyes warm. "Love doesn't die," she whispered. "It just waits until we're ready to see it again." The wind carried her words across the open land, over the fields, through the barn that had once held nothing but silence. And as the stars rose over the ranch, Thomas knew the place that had once broken him had become the very place that saved him. A full year passed, and the seasons circled back like an old song finding its last verse. The ranch, once gray and hollow, now stood proud against the horizon. Fences mended, crops tall, the barn painted bright beneath the endless blue. Life had come back to the land slow and steady, just as love had returned to the hearts that lived upon it. That morning the sun rose soft over the valley, catching the white curtains in the window of the little church at the edge of town. Inside, candles flickered like quiet blessings, their flames trembling in the still air. Clara stood near the altar, her hands folded gently in front of her. She wore a simple dress of cream and lace, nothing grand but beautiful in its honesty, just like her. Thomas waited near the doorway, straight back but nervous, his hat in his hands. He had faced drought, loneliness, and loss, but this moment, made his heart pound harder than any storm ever could. When he saw her turn, smiling softly beneath the morning light, he felt the world go still. The twins, dressed in their Sunday best, ran down the aisle laughing, each carrying a small wildflower from the ranch. They handed them to Clara, then to Thomas, before standing proudly between them. The preacher spoke words simple and true, about faith, about second chances, about love that rises from the ashes of sorrow. When it was done and Clara's hand rested in his, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years, complete. The weight that had lived on his chest for so long was gone, replaced by a peace that ran deep and quiet like a river after rain. Outside, the townsfolk cheered softly, tipping their hats, smiling the kind of smiles that come from seeing something right the world had set wrong. The twins danced in the dust, their laughter rising into the bright sky. Thomas lifted them both into his arms, and Clara laughed, a sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. As the four of them rolled back toward the ranch in the wagon, the road ahead stretched wide and golden. The wind tugged at Clara's veil, and the twins sang from the back, their voices small and sweet. Thomas glanced at her, his hand finding hers where it rested on the reins. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, eyes shining. "You didn't find it again," she said. "You made it." When they reached home, Thomas helped her down and paused, looking at the place where it all began. The old barn standing tall beneath the afternoon sun. He could almost see it as it was that first day, a lonely man hiring a stranger, a widow clutching her children, both of them carrying ghosts they didn't speak of. But now the ghosts were gone. The laughter of children filled the air. Flowers grew by the porch. The smell of bread drifted from the kitchen window. Thomas took off his hat, looked to the sky, and whispered, "Mary, thank you." The wind stirred gently, almost like a reply. He turned back toward the barn, where Clara and the twins waited, and smiled. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the world in gold and fire, the man who once thought love had died walked back into the light hand in hand with the family he never knew he was still waiting for. Thank you for watching this story of love and redemption. If it touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because somewhere another heart might need this story too.